nhớ trong số lần số tư đó nó cũng hóa nhẹ cao rồi xe trả tàu tuần chỉ nên số lần số tư cũng và thế kia xe thì nên sau đó những chiếc kia nó có nhớ giống lúc nào cũng nhớ trả lại nhận ra đã nâng hoa thì lần thứ bán tế tôi nói như tuần chỉ thọ nên sẽ là còn kia là gì nó cũng tiếp liền. The hallway was unguarded, oddly, as Silai made her way through, lowering her head, keeping herself from being discovered. Which door led to the outside? There were so many, and she had no clue how to get herself out of this maze. She chose a corridor and prayed it would lead her out and away. Instead, it led her to another hallway full of chamber doors. She opened one and found it was filled with beautiful, intricate design gowns with many hues. There were expensive jewelries and shoes all lined up. Without thinking, she walked in and reached out a hand to pick up a piece of earring. It sparkled as the light hit across the material, and a smile appeared on her face. Jim, what shot? Silai turned, and the earring dropped from her hand as the woman she'd heard Chisa call Gyochia entered. A young servant girl followed behind as she looked at Silai up and down. She picked up the earring on the ground and picked up a ceramic bowl. Silai watched in horror as she smashed the earring into pieces and let out a blood-curdling scream. 3 guards entered at once, and she pointed a finger at her. Silai opened her mouth to argue when they grabbed her and began dragging her out. She turned around to find the woman smiling at her with eyes full of hate. The chains around her wrists dug into her flesh, and she could feel the warm blood that began oozing out down her arms. She couldn't remember how long she'd been tied up like this. No food, no water, no sun, and Silai felt like she had swallowed her tongue. The guards who had brought her down had chained her and then left. Hours later, she was still chained with no escape in sight. The sounds that came to her ears frightened her. Torture was being used every other second, it seemed. The foul scent of blood and death was around her, threatening her very life. She saw a shadow forming, and then Gyochia rounded the corner with her lady-in-waiting. She was holding a whip in her hand, the kind that was spiked and left scars. She walked into the cell when Silai was held, and gave her a smile. Kasade kayo lang din. Kasava tiền chế có yếu in sang tế sẽ, chỉ sai ua có tư dùng gì nắm mà. Cú yêu từ mua bệ ổn ta ra, she cried. Cú xin chào nữ, Silai whispered. Để xin in chào có, the woman cried. Để cú yêu chủ chế có tàu luôn tế nắm mộ. Chỉ li cú yêu chú mua nụ công nữ cha. Silai wanted to laugh. She'd only heard of jealous women like her and had never had the pleasure of seeing one in person. A smile curved on her face, and this angered the woman even more. Có tí tua là có chừng mua xe lua thế lọ? She asked. Laughing, Silai replied, Cú lua vì ai các bác tôi cũng bỏ ý dạo và cũng xa tên chết nè tế tin nó. Là hại cho. She thảo kì lông she hậu sự. Cái hại đó chỉ đi có. Tin nâng tế chỉ mua khó she thảo lơ lý hại tìa. Tế chia bao nè mà khi kia khi tua. Tôi chỉ tàu yếu là. Nè là ua nè trên xìa. Tôi nói có bây giờ. Gyochia unrolled the whip, and with one strike it stung across her shoulder, ripping her dress. Blood began oozing as pain shot through her. Hãy dùng gì shot? Cú dùng xe khai cái kẻ đó có. Cú chỉ khai lo, Silai whispered. Cú chỉ tông cháy có kia. Chisa picked up the fruit to nibble as the servant brought in food. He hadn't been successful in finding where Silai disappeared to, and he was in a foul mood. When Tong Sing appeared, he was surprised to find him alone. He called out his name, and the young man walked toward him. Chisa, he asked. Dutch Bonzilla Ntoko? Jisa inquired. The look on Dongxing's face came as a surprise to him, as it meant the man had no idea what he was talking about. This frightened him and he stood up from his chair. Nirotula, tu hata Jisa, ti te ke na mo ke ti do ne, ku yin chi to pa ne la. Ku sa de Ntoko no. Before he could respond, one of the guards from the dungeon came to him and bowed before him. Morachi, he asked. Tu hata, ko ye ka pe wo le ya do tin sa khe? Ntxhi, he asked confused. Then he bolted out of the room and down the stairs to the dungeon. Cells lined up of prisoners who had gone against his father lay heavily wounded from punishments, and his heart dropped as he reached the final cell. There, tied to the pole, was Silai. Her shoulders had been torn from the whip, and what made his hands curled into fists was that it would leave scars since the whip held spikes. Tutsi, he cried. The guards came pouring in with frightened eyes. He turned around and pointed to her. No one responded. He walked forward and threw a punch at one of them. Kaila! Duhatai, they said in unison as they dropped to their knees. He unchained her and she fell to his arms. Someone was going to die for this. Jisa watched as she gently came to, and her eyes fluttered awake. The skin from the spikes had ripped her flesh, and the surgeon had promised that with this new technique he learned, there would be no scars. But the salve he left behind had to be applied daily. He'd bandaged her wound and redressed her in a new gown. He asked. She lowered her eyes and looked away. Guchipo. Gotchen Jai Gutella. Guhali Yadokotonza. Yelungtu was ship head got Jing Jaigo. Kaila! He shouted loudly, so loud that she jumped. Silai remained silent. He knew she was stubborn. But how could she be this hard-headed? She had promised to never keep him in the dark when he came to her safety, and in a blink of an eye, the promise had been violated. Kaila, he whispered gently. Lungtu ship head got. She sobbed. Nu bao chi thought chi ka bao na. Kia ka le su chi sa. Ka le. He shut his eyes from pain and gently pulled her into his arms. In his embrace, she let go her emotions as his hands came to protect her. He had to be gentle with her, for she was a woman who had been lied to and now betrayed. Kutatsi kuti tai chi tau ka li kuto che, he whispered. Ka lea. Ku yai tan sa ke. Ka ya tu watai. Chi chi nya o ke li pun yu shi bao. Ka nya ka lun tu ku mo ku li ke mu. She saw she bao rong dua. He lowered his lips to hers and kissed her deeply, inhaling her scent, and brushed his hands through her hair. And when he pulled away, he heard Yochia's voice at the entrance of his chamber. Jisa, ye vini kya de bo khai ka the li mo kya lo shao ka lo za pu. He let her go and stood up, his hands shaking at his sides as he watched the woman glare at him. Ya ka li ta mong li kya? He asked. Nu chi ya. De shi de tu pa ne khai chu mon be ka chen kya lo shao ka lo kya pu the la. Ka chen chai ka ki ma la kya. Cô tụi nàng hù nào tôi chỉ tao bấy sao? Ủa là già nữ ham mua lúc hít khí nào ổn đây cô? He glared at her. Tao mu. Chỉ sao? Tao mu! He shouted. Tao sư bữa mình chỉ sư này chỉ tối rồi đi làm à? What she said perked his attention as she turned to walk out. Tao cha. She paused and turned around as he neared her. Smiling, she replied, Ka lang xie la. Her eyes danced around the subject, and he knew exactly why. The person holding the whip, who drew Silai's blood, was her. He said. He watched as her eyes filled with fear, and then the color drained from her face. When she turned to go, he grabbed her arm and swung her around. Yochia, Mondo ya nyaho kuluneng, kutsu chipulun the chu. Silai ya itu. Ya ka chang la jay doa, ka ya pao ite na monzo ko mo kalika. He shoved her off and she stumbled backward. He reached for the door and shut it as tears streamed down her face. Jisa turned to find Silai sitting in bed, her pale face watching him. She whispered. He walked to her and sat down beside her, but she looked away from him. He tilted her chin to look up at him. She didn't answer him. and anger filled him as he watched her eyes brimming with tears. Cô tao hai lý giả đó có lại. Giờ ấy tôi tiến hành ngọc hệ đó có chuyện người dài cô. Ta xin nhớ tôi có gì sai đó có yếu na. Ta chỉ cố tôi chỉ tao lần nữa na. Có bằng cả xe để con nó trong này cả. Ít tôi bắt nhẹ cho lên này cho, cô xin chờ cô luôn nè. Giờ cô chỉ bảo ở đây tôi kịp bự trong này na, cô chỉ nghĩ chuyện gì nữaอย่างgạo. Tôi bắt nhẹ yếu là đi cô luôn bên đó cô nè. Nhớ chỉ lúc bây sinh hoa hử. Nhớ chỉ cho lên na. She moved out of his touch and gathered herself from his reach. Cô chỉ muốn chỉ hành gì đó có lại. Giờ thì có chỉ muốn hello chỉ cô giờ đặt áo một cô lúc chụp. She stood up and he blocked her path. Cô lúc chụp giờ nào. Có chỉ nhận được cô là. She glared at him and gave him a stiff smile. Cô giờ giả bảo ai để thứ bên nhà con. Giờ hai tiền được làm thằng sao cái gì, chỉ là làm thằng sao cái gì xia. Her room had a stench of mold as she tossed the small collection of wood she managed to find on the ground. It was cold, and she was shivering as she started the fire. The blanket on the bed wasn't silk as it was with the prince's chamber. It had a scratchy material, but it would keep her from being cold. She sat down on the bed and reached for the blanket where she lost her footing and fell to the ground where the stitches tore it open. Warm blood oozed down her shoulder, and she saw the red liquid pool from her arm. A knock came at the door, and Tong Seng entered with a horrified look on his face. Racing in, he helped her stand up. Yo, ni got a gum on Silai, he asked gently. Chimorachi. He helped her to sit on the bed and walked out of the room where he returned shortly with some towels to help her clean up. The pain had her gritting her teeth, and damn these tears that kept welling up in her eyes. Yalang te uli na ka, tu wa tai papao, he asked. Galea, she whispered. Galea. He finished and set the bowl aside with the bloody towels. He helped her to lay down and pulled the blanket up to her. Kamutala, she whispered. Sahaliko, Yekuwakalo. He sat down on the ground as exhaustion took over her. She was so tired. So very tired that her eyes were threatening to close on her. The heat from the fire kept her warm, and with Dong Sen close by, she felt safe. She smiled at him and let sleep take over her. She dreamt of a pair of hands, hands that raised her, hands that held her, protected her, hands that belonged to her father and the man who she never got to say goodbye to. See, she whispered. See, Sacha Kuchea, Kusi! She jerked awake and found not Dong Seng by her side, but the crown prince. He was watching her with those dark eyes of his and a gentle worry over his handsome face. He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. Kaboya, he asked. She asked as she sat up, faster than needed, and gasped from the pain. He reached for her, but she quickly got out of his hold. Jisa asked. Silai looked up at him with a glare that made him blink in shock. Gunsuka. She turned to go when he took her into his arms and held her as she cried. She knew it wasn't anger from him taking her. It was more pain from dreaming of her father. Once she started crying, the pain exploded. She let the dams open and everything she'd been holding inside bled out. Kutsi. She cried. She felt his hands over her head, and the tenderness he gave her quieted her sobs. Silai, he whispered. She pulled away from him. His eyes narrowed. Silai blinked and looked away. His mother was poisoned? When she turned back around to look at him, He was breathing heavily, and a look of exhaustion appeared in his eyes. Cái cho cái gì cho cái lúc cả, cú nhẹ lên như lúc của yên gạo. Mình nhổ cho cái lúc đó ý lần nhẹ lần gì cái trong tia. Cái chơi cái nhẹ thế cái gì, cú lấy như chơi à na. Cái gì tôi cho cái ổn chua cú nhẹ tôi cho cú bảo chế, cái thế cú, sĩ ra đây mà đi cả. She lowered her face. Cú thought gì? Cú sao chỉ sợ tia, không mua cái gì nhẹ đi cú. Laughing, he replied. Vì cú ya tôi hoa tài, bây giờ. Ai cú chỉ năng lo. Vì lý cả cú thế lý chỉ mua chanh đó con trơn đó có quan đó có gì nhẹ đó. Cú chỉ tao sai cú cho cái yêu na. Cú cho lúc đó có hai tia, cú mà đi ba có từ khi, giờ con bao cú lúc không muốn đi, cái tôi qua chỉ mua chân cầu giờ có. Giờ có sai cú ba có từ tia, chó rải cú thọ con chân cú. Kyochia finished brewing the herbal tea and prepared everything on the tray to bring to Chisa. She patted her dress to make sure everything looked in place and carried the tray toward his chamber. She was going to make an effort to win his heart once and for all. She was determined to be his bride in name, in bed, and in heart. She rounded the corner and his chamber door came into view. She pushed open and her feet stopped short as she entered. There on the bed, tangled up in his embrace, was Silai. Her hair was spilled across his mighty naked chest as one arm was wrapped around her shoulder, while one lay under his head. The image made her shake so hard that she dropped the tray. It clattered and it woke him up. He sat up and draped a blanket around Silai's shoulder as he reached for the blue robe to put around himself. He walked to where she stood and stared at the mess on the ground before he lifted his eyes up to look at her. Nzata molina kala wala chi, he asked. Chisa. Yaviri kya? Tu po khain da mo la chi ku chi mo. Khai ku sha. Ka pa pa ha tia chin nak shit sang ku sana. He raised an eyebrow. Tili. Jale mu jola. Chi sa la ta ku. Kyochia watched as he turned back around to her, and she bolted out of the room, tears burning her eyes, making her sob like a wild child. Once she reached her chamber, she ripped the bedsheets off and threw them on the ground. Jealousy coursed through her heart, and she screamed. Her lady-in-waiting entered with a frightful expression as she gathered the bedsheets on the ground. Chisa, Queen chỉ cho cái gì? Cái nhiều chủ của tôi sẽ tới ta. Giờ có chỉ sai cô, giờ có sai lúc họ tôi. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and exhaled deeply. No one would stand in her way to get the life she wanted. Right now, she wanted to be Chisa's bride, and she would do anything to earn that title. She dabbed on a few drops of perfume and headed toward Prince Mongsu's wing. She knew exactly what she needed to do. If Chisa wouldn't remove that slave from his wing, then she would find someone who would take her from his life. His brother would be the perfect one for that job. This would be her answer to her yearning. 我找我那时的整地了工，顿知顿的ra đến hình lần thường bán tế,顿trao也tự sự ra tận đây nó. Bé mà đi xin chi đùa.